Imagine a mountain called Old Rocky. It sits a day's journey from the coastline to the east and 2 days' journey from a well-known lake to the west. The north side of the mountain is covered with ice and snow at the peak, and the rest is barren and rocky, and the south side is lush and green. Imagine two villagers who grew up on either side of Old Rocky describing the mountain they grew up on to a third party. They describe the location, a day's journey from the coastline to the east and 2 days' journey from the lake to the west, and they're both in agreement thus far. But then the northerner says, Old Rocky is barren with a large snow-covered peak. The other says, hold on, that mountain is predominantly lush and green. They quibble back and forth over the specifics of Old Rocky, with the northerner holding that the mountain is snow-covered and barren, perhaps a small shrub here and there, but certainly not lush or verdant. And the southerner claims snow is minor, if at all, and the mountain is essentially entirely green. The northerner and the southerner clearly disagree about the details and specifics. For the third party to witness the disagreements over whether the mountain is snow-topped or verdant and green or not, and decide they must be speaking of two different mountains would be absurd, if all the other details about the specific location and name of the mountain is the same. A difference in details from the point of perspective do not equate to discrepancy on the item being described. Or to put it another way, different descriptions of the same referent do not entail different reference. In Protestant and specifically in evangelical circles, the claim is often made that due to Muslims and Jews' rejection of Jesus as God, that they must consequently be worshiping a different God than the Trinitarian God of the Christians. They'll often ground their claims in verses like John 5:23, quote, "Whoever does not honor the Son does not honor the Father who sent him." And 1 John 2:23, "No one who denies the Son has the Father, but whoever confesses the Son has the Father as well." They cite these verses to say, by rejecting Jesus, they have rejected God the Father. Therefore, when they say God, Adonai, or Allah, they are not speaking of the same God that we Christians worship. But not having the Father does not entail referring to a different being. It means lacking true communion with Him apart from the Son. If when Jews and Muslims say God, Yahweh, Adonai, Elohim, or Allah, they mean the one God, the uncreated creator, the God of Abraham, then they're describing the same one God, uncreated creator, God of Abraham, that Christians are when they say God. The referent is the same, although their descriptions may differ. In the mountain illustration, both perspectives render different descriptions of the same intended object. The actual object being referenced is the same regardless of one's knowledge or perception of it. And so, while the southerner may be incorrect in saying the mountain is entirely covered in trees, in light of the truth that the northern side is barren and has a much greater prevalence of snow and ice. That discrepancy does not confirm that the northerner and southerner are speaking of different mountains, especially when they agree on more foundational things like the location and name. Now let's say a pilot was to fly over the mountain and take a photograph, showing the truth of the matter. Either villager could reject the photograph as fake and staunchly hold to their view and deny the truth outright, and yet when they say, Old Rocky, they're still referencing the same mountain. In the same way, a rejection of the Incarnation or the Trinity is a rejection of the truth that's been revealed indeed, but does not change the intentional referent. The only way the intentional referent could change would be to redefine the boundaries which the word God is encompassing. For instance, to speak of an impersonal, abstract force rather than the personal and relational God of Abraham would be to deviate from the shared boundaries of what is meant by God. And thereby, at that point, the one speaking of the impersonal, abstract force would indeed be referencing a different God than the Christian God. For instance, if the northerner said, hold on, the old Rocky I'm referencing isn't near the coast nor lake at all. Or the southerner was to say, now hold on a minute, you think Old Rocky is a mountain? Old Rocky's a range of small hills. Then it would be safe to assume that they're speaking of different mountains or different landforms entirely, since the intended reference is no longer the same. An agreement on God being the one God, the God of Abraham, the uncreated creator, functions as a rigid designator that fixes reference even amid false or conflicting beliefs. Much like the location of the landmass in question and the distinction that the landmass is indeed a mountain, which both parties addresses by a common name, affirms that both the northerner and the southerner are referencing the same thing, however they may disagree on the other details. To put this in another way, both flat earthers and round earthers differ markedly from their understandings of the earth, its shape, its nature, even the universe and solar systems at large, hence the names. However, when a flat earther says earth, he means the exact same thing that a round earther means when he says earth. And this is the case regardless of what evidence either side stacks up for the validity of their claim. Either side may very well point out that the other's views are incompatible with reality as they see it, but at no point does this divergence of understanding imply that they have ceased to speak of the same thing when either one says earth or the world. So what about those verses? According to the Bible, to reject Jesus is to reject God, right? Well, simply put, yes. But to reject Jesus as God doesn't mean that from then on, when you say the God of Abraham, you are suddenly referencing another God. The zeal to make the distinction between the Christian understanding of God and the Jewish or Muslim understanding is well-intentioned. It's a stand against a culture of theological relativism and coexist stickers. It's planting a flag, drawing a line in the sand, saying Christ and the Trinity are essential to the faith and are the only right or correct ways to understand God. It's a stand for the fullness of truth, which, while commendable and honorable at the point of intention, it's an overreach that logically speaking cannot carry the weight its proponents intend. In the realm of argumentation and debate, which is intrinsic to the vast majority of evangelistic work, the most effective strategies revolve around finding common ground and building the case from there. Whether it be reason, logic, scripture, science, history, or emotion, whatever the case may be, finding common ground is the first step. Christians have tremendous common ground with Jews and Muslims, especially in comparison to other religions like Buddhism, Hinduism, or any of the great hosts of polytheistic or even non-theistic religions. I've heard many conversion stories and testimonies from ex-Muslims and ex-Jews where they sought the Lord through prayer, praying to Allah or Adonai or Elohim, asking that He reveal or confirm the truth of Jesus in their hearts and minds. And God has answered their prayers. So despite a misunderstanding of the truth, their prayers to God, as He was currently understood by them, were answered by God. Think of the tremendous courage and risk it takes to be open to God in a way that is completely foreign to your upbringing or culture. To believe in Jesus or in the Trinity and convert to Christianity is a death sentence in at least 10 countries, according to the Humanists International's Freedom of Thought report in 2024. So imagine if you were Muslim or Jewish, you have faith in God and are earnestly seeking to live your life in accord with God's will and feel drawn by God to Christianity. And then some Christians claim you're actually worshiping a demon and that you need to worship some other God, the true God, whom they claim you currently have no relationship with. That would be a hindrance to the faith. Instead, we ought to be careful to start where grace is already at work. Acknowledge the God they intend, namely the one uncreated creator, the God of Abraham, and from that common ground we can invite them into the fullness of God's self-revelation in Christ. That's the route faithful to truth and reason and maximally persuasive. To be abundantly clear, I'm not saying the differences are trivial. The Trinity and Jesus' divinity are essentials revealed to us by God. My claim, rather, is this, that saying Jews, Christians, and Muslims worship different gods equivocates and confuses description with referent. It relabels a deficient conception as a new deity. That's a logical error. The inference that in order for us to be referencing the same God requires my exact or particular theology is equivocation masquerading as precision. For instance, when Lois Lane speaks of Clark Kent, she may have no idea she's speaking of Superman. In fact, she may even reject the notion that Clark Kent and Superman are one and the same. The reality of the situation is that even if she were to speak of Clark Kent explicitly as Clark Kent alone and not as Superman, the truth of them being one and the same is still true, and to reference Superman is unwittingly or not to reference Clark Kent. Lois may very well believe that Superman can fly, and that Clark Kent, as a supposed ordinary fellow, can't fly. She can deny the fact that Clark Kent can fly, and yet when referencing Clark Kent, she's actually referencing Superman as well. To even emphatically deny both that Clark is Superman and that Clark can fly won't change the fact that Clark is Superman. Therefore, in the ultimate sense, to reference Clark is to reference, perhaps inadvertently, Superman. In the same way, a Muslim or Jew can deny the Trinity or any other essential Christian doctrine and yet unwittingly be referencing the same triune God of the Christians when they speak of God. Because ultimately, the one uncreated creator, the God of Abraham, that Jews and Muslims worship, is one and the same with the triune God of the Christians. Again, a difference in description doesn't create a different deity as the referent. Denying an essential truth about X makes your belief false about X. It doesn't make you reference Y when you say X or reference X. If same God is so strict as to mean my exact theological understanding of God and any deviation from the particulars I consider or understand to be true indicate we have ceased to speak of the same God, then the door is open to consider even alternative Christian understandings of God and His nature or relation to us as another God. For instance, in the classic Calvinist Arminian debate, both worship the triune Creator, affirm God's omniscience, omnipotence, Scripture's authority, original sin, and salvation by grace through Christ. Yet, each side's view is incompatible with the other's. Churches even split over these issues, so the differences are hardly trivial. It would be poisoning the well for either side to say, well, they worship a God of their own creation. My God, the God of the Bible, isn't like that. That would be to set up a false dilemma. Likewise, straining the logic and rejecting the common ground we share with Jews and Muslims in the name of doctrinal fidelity, a move that can hinder evangelism, does not show Christ's heart. A different description of the same God doesn't mint a new deity. It marks a need for correction. Indeed, we must share the truth, but always in love. Thank you for listening, and may God bless you.